Hello everybody, I am very excited to kick off this course, Ulysses, for the rest of us here at MoLI. I'm in the garden behind MoLI, it's really pretty here. I'm gonna go through this prep video and tell you a bunch of things, so let me tell you what I'm gonna tell you and then we'll start. So I'm gonna tell you about the structure of this course / book club. I'm gonna tell you about my engagement with the book, why I love it, why this book is thought to be so difficult, what you need to read this book, and then just some tips for reading it. So this will probably be the longest journey in this course, aside from reading the book, this long preparatory lecture. But the good thing about it is it'll set you up for everything you need to get started, get rolling, and not have to have too many stops and halts and frustrations along the way. So let's start with my engagement with the book. I didn't grow up in Ireland. I grew up in the US. And so the difference between maybe some of your experiences with the book and mine is that you don't really know what Ulysses is in the US. I mean, if you're into literature, sure, you've heard of Ulysses, you've heard of James Joyce, but just the general population, you would have never known who James Joyce was. You know, there's no statues to him at the mall or whatever that you would see when you're shopping. So I had to find out about it by just seeing this huge, intimidating looking book on the shelf at a bookstore I worked at. And I asked people, what is this book? And everyone said, it's great, it's impossible to read, and nobody ever really reads it, right? So that probably sounds familiar to you. When I was an undergrad, there was a course called James Joyce. And because I'd seen the book a bunch of times and it looked intimidating and weird, I wanted to take this course, which focused mostly on reading Ulysses. I had this great professor, Jonathan Quick. He was the kind of guy who I think in the US, especially in education, is sort of sorely absent at this point, where he was just a close reader of books. He just loved the books that he read. He talked about them with such love. It wasn't about dissecting them or talking about this or that political point. Not that I mind that, I find that valuable too, but he just had a different way of reading and it was just an expression of love for the book. So I spent a semester basically reading this book, and you know, it was amazing. It blew my mind and I absolutely fell in love with it. Why do I love Ulysses? There's so many reasons why I love it. I mean, the first is pretty simple, which is that my whole life I always wanted to live in Ireland, and it took place in Ireland, it took place in Dublin. But more than just taking place in Dublin, it really evokes this place really intensely where I am right now. So this is something that you should know going in, which is that it evokes the place by using real names of real people, real places, real events, all that sort of stuff. And you might think that you need to know all of that, but you would never be able to read the book if you did, because it's packed with them. One small example of this, but it's representative, is in one of the chapters, some half-drunk men, or maybe totally drunk, it's hard to say sometimes, are talking about this judge, Sir Frederick Falconer, and they're talking about two of his qualities. One is that he's an anti-Semite, and two is that he's sort of a bleeding heart for poor people. Now, it doesn't go and explain who this judge is. It doesn't really talk in depth about the cases, even though some of them may or may not have been real cases. It just drops his name, talks about his qualities, which are actually real qualities of this person, and moves on. Ulysses never holds your hand. It puts its arm around you as it walks with you, but it never holds your hand through the book. And so that can be a little daunting, but it's also one of the reasons why it's so evocative, because isn't that what it's like walking through a city, hearing snippets of people's conversations, seeing sights that maybe you've passed by 100 times but didn't recognize, hearing about new people. I love Ulysses because of the plot. The plot is deceptively simple. It's about two men and one woman on one day in Dublin. The two men are wandering around the city and eventually bump into each other. And the woman, MoLI, her husband is one of the characters. So it's MoLI Bloom, Leopold Bloom, and Stephen Dedalus. And MoLI Bloom, for whom this museum is actually named, just lying in bed and thinking. She might have done a few things during the day, but mostly we see her lying in the bed and thinking. Now, a lot of people like to make the two men representative of certain things. So for instance, Stephen Dedalus, who is also in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, is a super intellectualized character. I mean, he's just into, I don't know, the smart sort of philosophical kind of nerdy stuff. Leopold Bloom is much more artistic, emotive soul. And so people like to say that it's this kind of scientific, analytic meeting the artistic. I don't really like that interpretation. I mean, it's useful for some people, but I like to just see these people as people, or maybe because sometimes I can be a bit egotistical, I like to think of them as two parts of myself. I mean, if you know anything about me, I have a very sort of artistic, carnal, a bit of a vulgar side, and then I have a super intellectual, serious side, and I've struggled a lot of my life to bring those two parts together. And so in this book, there's this kind of wandering of these two parts of myself. That's how I feel about it, that come together at a certain point. And then there's this other really beautiful flowing narrative that's running alongside the entire thing in MoLI. So take it as you want, but I love that plot. It seems simple, but there's a lot of different ways to interpret it. And that's just mine. I love Ulysses because it's a vulgar book. So you should know that going in. It shows people, human beings, and we all have vulgar lives. This book is full of shit and piss and masturbation and sex and lust and cuckolding and, all sorts of kinks. I mean, it's just filled with all of these things. Can you imagine at the time that it was written? And, as a result, it was a real struggle to get this book published. In fact, it was supported in publication and only made it into publication through the help of a lot of anarchists, a lot of artists, a lot of free thinkers, mostly women, and then a lot of court battles as well. Joyce once said, as an artist, I'm against every state. The state is concentric and man is eccentric. So I think that, there's this very challenging, threatening, but also sexual, obscene core to this book. But it's just a reflection of how we live, who we are, how we think, and what we desire and what we long for. And I love it for that reason. I really love Ulysses, and I'm also so struck by the way reading it actually alters your consciousness in a strange way. I know that sounds weird, like I'm talking about the book like it's ayahuasca or something like that, but it is really a great book and it messes with your mind. And I thought that I was sort of alone in this, even though I was taking a course with all these other people when I first read it. I thought I was alone in it, but then I found out actually one of the ways in which Ulysses got published in those obscenity trials that I was talking about in the US was someone brought that up in court, talked to one of the judges in 1933 about how it had sort of attenuated his consciousness, the lawyer defending it, attenuated his consciousness to the little things in the courtroom that he never would have noticed before. It just helped his mind alight on the tiniest details, the most minute things. And then the judge said, I have to admit, I agree with you. It's done the same thing to me. And that's how they recognized it and knew that it was a work of art. And I love that about this book. And I also love Ulysses because I know a lot about what Joyce went through, what he endured as he was writing this book. He was having iritis, this constant horrible pain in his eyes. So he was constantly getting eye operations and going gradually more and more blind. He was just always in this sort of emotional, mental turmoil. There was a war, he was poor, and just trying to produce this giant book against all those forces that were trying to stop it from being published. Some of his best friends who were writers were saying, no, you got to cut this part out, it's too complicated. And he was always resisting that. So there's so much put into this book and you can't help but love it. I mean, when people talk about how reading it is difficult, once you know how difficult it was for Joyce to write it and then get it published, you start to understand what an act of love this book is for people and for literature. So I'm going to now talk about some of those reasons why people say it's hard and maybe why we don't have to worry about that so much as we go in. So what makes Ulysses so difficult? Why is it so intimidating to people? Why do people have trouble reading this huge book that is filled with incomprehensible sentences? Okay, I'll tell you why. But before I say that, I want to say a lot of the things that make it difficult are also what make it awesome, what make it so fun to read. And the way to sum that up maybe is that the book is inexhaustible. I've read this book many, many times now, and each time it is a different book to me. I learn something new every time. It's not just like I find some new sentence or new word. It really is a different read every single time because it's so complex and layered. And so in all my readings, I will never get it right, and I'll also never get it wrong. And that's something that I really, really want to impress on you as you go along reading this book. You can't really get it wrong. Now, as I say that, I want you to know also, if you're reading this for the first time, I'm kind of at least a little bit in the boat with you of feeling the nervousness of the difficulty and being able to interpret it and read it the right way, because I'm not a scholar. I mean, that's part of why I'm doing this book club with you, because it's called Ulysses for the rest of us. The scholarly work on it, which there's so much, is really valuable. It's really fascinating if you want to get into it afterwards, somewhere down the line. And I certainly have read a lot of that work. But I have this tension that there are some scholars, especially here in Dublin, that are going to be like, no, you idiot, you got that part wrong. Or maybe not you idiot, gobshite, maybe that's the word that they would use. But anyway, I'm sure I'm gonna get a lot wrong even in leading you through this. And maybe I would have gotten it right 3 years ago, because your interpretations and your read of the book will change over time. So as you read it, I want you to remember that your reading of Ulysses is your reading of Ulysses, and it is useful and valuable and worthwhile and valid. That said, it is going to be a book unlike any book you've ever read before. The reason why most people find Ulysses difficult, and the most obvious reason, I should say, is the style. People sometimes call the style stream of consciousness. I don't really use that term. I think that we could say that there's a sort of breathing in and out of the world and all its aspects in this book. What does that mean? Well, it's not always apparent from reading this book, at least not immediately, if you're reading someone thinking, or if you're reading an object that's in the setting, if you're reading an event that's happening, who's speaking, all that. It actually just kind of blurs the lines between all those things. Now, you might think like, Joyce, why did you make it so difficult for us? But before you make that judgment, which I'm sure you'll make many times as you read the book for the first time, as I did as well, just think about what it's like to walk through, walk down the street, walk through your day. Like, when you're walking down the street, it's not some single coherent narrative, from start to finish that has a start, a beginning and middle and an end. You might be walking and thinking about, GAA, and then you're suddenly looking at a flower, and then you bump into someone and you think, oh, that person's a jerk, and then be like, hi, how you doing, And then you walk away and you're grumbling in your head again, and then you look back and you don't see them, so you start thinking about, oh, where'd they go to? They go into that building, blah, blah, blah. And then you might start focusing on something that happened to you yesterday. In other words, the world isn't one just sort of compact and neat narrative that's just running from start to end. It's a constant flowing in and out of events, objects, thoughts. You could even do it right now. I mean, it might mess your head up a little bit, but just pay attention to what your actual experience is. And Joyce was trying to stay very close to that. It's really stunning the way he pulls it off as well. But just remember that, instead of getting frustrated, think, well, I actually do this all the time, every day, the way this book is mapped out. This bleeds into the book in all sorts of ways, and it turns itself into different forms throughout the book. So in one chapter, for instance, he's echoing the forms of music and how we might think of and experience music. And it sounds crazy. I mean, there are these long words in there, there's onomatopoeia, there's different musical structures, different instruments, all that, and it's all coming at you, and it's so intense, but it really does evoke the feeling or the presence of music when you read that chapter, which is so strange. It's not just like someone says, he was at the symphony, the violins went off, all that kind of stuff. He's actually trying to evoke the presence of music in you when you read. And so it's very generous in that way. Even though it might be difficult, it's also generous, and it shows this intense sense of compassion and love for how we think and how we experience things. So let's just try to, as we go forward, just lay aside any blame we might have for Joyce for making the book too difficult. Ultimately, I think we can view these difficulties as a sort of faith in the reader, a love of humanity, a love of consciousness, of thinking, of art. So if we can sort of shift our perspective to that, we can really enjoy the book a lot more. So from there, I'm going to move on now to talking about what you need. There's not that many things you need to read this book, but what you need to read this book. So the first thing you need is Ulysses. That should be pretty obvious. You might have questions about which edition to get. Now, this is going to be controversial because of all that scholarly stuff I was talking about. Some scholars hate this book, which is the Gabler or Gabler edition. I actually don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's the Gabler or Gabler edition. This is my old beat up written in copy. There's some debate over whether or not this is the good version or the bad version. This is the version that they're going to have at MoLI. You can order it. It's a great version, and everybody will, be on the same page if you all order the same version. But it doesn't matter, really. I mean, there are some editions that I would say, like, try not to get, seriously abridged editions or whatever. But besides that, you can't really go wrong. It just might be useful to you to have the same pagination. And one of the reasons why I really like this edition too is because I'm going to recommend an annotated book to help you along. And this edition, you might be able to see it has numbers in the side that correspond to the number of the annotations of that book. So that could be really helpful for you as you proceed. The second thing you need to read this book is a good grasp on how much time it takes you to read. If you were to just read from start to finish effortlessly, it would be probably about 25 hours, something like that. Nobody ever reads it that way. Plus, you're going to be listening to the walkthroughs of each chapter, you're meeting with me and other people that are in the book club / course, whatever. And it is going to take a little longer because you're not probably used to reading books that are written in this style. There are no other books written in this style, so you're definitely not used to reading books in this style if you haven't read it before. So you'll need to stop quite a bit. Declan Kibbard, who's Joyce, well, he's a literature scholar, but he's a Joyce scholar, I think, first and foremost in my mind. And he said, Ulysses is designed to produce readers capable of reading Ulysses, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but it's like, as you read it, you'll get better at it, and you'll get more into it, and there'll be, snags and stopping points for everybody. Everybody has the difficult chapter for them where they really feel like stopping. A lot of people stop in the same place. I'll talk about that when we actually start the course. But I think you'll find that it flows, the process of reading flows a little more easily as you go along. The last thing you need, and this is it really, is a pen. And maybe you want a notebook with that. You're going to encounter in the book things that you understand, don't understand, you have questions about, you want to look up later. Maybe there's a joke in there that there's some jokes that I do not get the punchline in, maybe just because I'm not from Ireland, originally, but there are going to be jokes in there that you don't get, little lines that maybe a mention of a real person that you want to look up or whatever. You just want to write in the margins as you go. Don't stop, just write as you go. I don't always write in books, so that's why I'm saying if you want a notebook, but Ulysses is actually kind of a good book to write in. I think also, I'm saying don't stop as you read, just write, because if you stop every single time or you're checking the annotations every single time, you're never going to get through it because there's so much, like I said. So the notes are for you, and one of the reasons why you want to take notes actually is so you can just keep going and not look back at the notes that you took. Something else you might want is just a good supplemental book. One of them that I've told MoLI to order for this is Ulysses Annotated, which is Ulysses Annotated, but actually it's not the full text, it's just the annotation, so you use that in conjunction with this edition of Ulysses. There are other supplemental books that I think are pretty good, and there's something called the Gilbert Schema, written by Stuart Gilbert. You may have heard that each chapter in this book is related to some, an episode in the Odyssey, that there's a different organ for each one, all that kind of stuff, for each chapter, all that kind of stuff. It's like this alchemical, almost law of correspondences, magical thing that's happening in this book. And maybe you want to sort through that. I'm going to talk about in a minute with the tips for reading whether or not that's so important, but you might want that just for satisfaction. Maybe you're like a really organizational, like Virgo-y kind of person, and you want to look into that. So you might want to, but it's not necessary. All you need is the book, a grasp on time, how you map out your time with reading, and a pen. So how does this course work? Let me just lay out that for you real quickly, and then I'm going to tell you the tips for reading, and then we're done. So basically, this course book club works like this. Each week, I'm going to post a walkthrough. It's just audio, so you can listen to it in your headphones or whatever, of what happens in the chapters. Trust me, you want this. You want someone saying, this happens, and this happens, and this happens. Just a basic map of what actually goes on in the chapter. And you want to listen to those and then read. And you can, obviously listen to, if I put down 3 chapters in a walkthrough, you can listen to all 3 at once, but it might be better for you to just listen to 1 and then read that chapter, and then 2 and then read that chapter. You see what I mean? Then roughly every 2 weeks, starting the week of Bloomsday, I'm gonna show up, streaming from MoLI, talk to you all about things that were interesting to me about the assigned chapters for that chunk of time. And then maybe sometimes I'll have a guest who comes in and just talks about why Ulysses was meaningful to them for 10 minutes or so. It's not going to be scholarly stuff, just like, what does this book mean to me? Why do I love it? Why is it important? Because that's what I really want us to focus on. And then you'll have a chance to talk with each other as well. So that's basically it. You listen to the walkthrough, you read the chapters that are given, and then you meet. And that's all going to be on moli.ie/Ulysses. So that's MOLI, Museum of Literature Ireland.ie/Ulysses. Now, while you're doing that, you might get the temptation to read ahead. I mean, if you are so bold, don't do it. Just try to stick with everybody else. I think that there's something valuable in staying in the sort of energy of everybody else reading, even if you feel like you've got it down and you want to rush ahead. I think it's good to just stay with the group. But go ahead, rush ahead if you want to. Now, I've got a few tips for reading the book and for when you get stuck. And, these have been really helpful for people that I've led through reading this book before. And there were things that I did when I read it on subsequent readings, not that first one, and what I've learned over time from reading this book. So here we go. Here are some tips on how to get through it and just enjoy it. So the first one, this is the tried and true trick that everybody talks about, is if you get stuck, read it out loud. Just read where you're stuck out loud. This will work much easier for people that live here, by the way, than in Ireland than it did for me when I was in the US, because a lot of it is just like accent stuff or, certain words or, Hiberno English, whatever, that kind of stuff that I just couldn't get. But once you hear it in your voice, and even me, coming from the East Coast of the US, like saying the words out loud, it really gets it into a sort of rhythm where you can hear it. And even if you still don't get it, you just appreciate a lot of times the poetry, the beauty of the line that you're reading out loud. So that's the first thing. When you get stuck, read out loud. 2 is try to read through the entire chapter when you can. So like, if you can set aside enough time to actually just read a whole chapter without stopping, that's great. Now, there are some chapters in here that are much longer than others, so you might not be able to do that. If you have to stop in the middle of a chapter, take your pen and write down what just happened in the margin of where you were. So write down what happened, what you were thinking of when you pick it back up. Because sometimes this book can get so dense or confusing. If you set it down, it's hard to pick back up and just jump right back in. So write down what just happened if you have to stop. But hopefully you'll just be able to get through each chapter in one sitting. Just sit down, read the chapter, and go on. if you falter, pick it back up. This is a big book. People falter with this book all the time. It's completely normal. If you're ever like, this is just too hard, or I really like that last chapter, but this one I dislike. There's a chapter in here, I'm not gonna say which one it is, but out of all my readings, I still do not like this one chapter. So I falter even when I read this book, having read it, I think, 8 or 9 times at this point, I still falter with this book. So it's normal, it'll happen, just pick it back up, because the thing is, that if you don't like one chapter, you're having a hard time, the next chapter is actually going to be completely different, often wildly different in style, so you may be able to enjoy it completely afresh in that next chapter. The fourth thing, this is gonna be a contentious one, guys. Avoid YouTube videos about the book. There are lots of YouTube videos on Joyce, about how Joyce is a terrible person, about how this book should only be read with this one thing in mind, about how there's only one interpretation, about how what he really meant was this or this. Again, I really want to stress that your reading of Ulysses is valid. This book is such an intense exploration of individuality. So your individuality brought to bear in this book matters. Don't worry about the YouTube videos. Don't turn to them for help. What I would do is find someone who could read it with you, to turn to them for help, so you can have a conversation about it. But I just think that a lot of times these videos, it's just people very often with their own opinions trying to make sure that you share the opinion that they have. I mean, that's just the internet, but you know what I mean. So I would skip it if you can. All right, this one is gonna maybe be a little surprising, but there's a movie based on the book, Ulysses, from 1967, directed by Joseph Strick, I think. And obviously you cannot make a movie based on this book, not really. However, it is a beautiful movie that actually can get you re-enthused for the book. So if you ever find yourself stuck, go find the Ulysses movie. I'm sure, I don't know all the ways movies are available here in Ireland, but I'm sure it's available. So go find it and watch it. It's a great movie. And then you can tell everybody you read the book. No, I mean, just watch the movie to get back into the book. It's a great movie and actually does clarify some points, and it can give visuals to the things that maybe you're having some difficulty visualizing from time to time. All right, the audiobook version of Ulysses. This is a great way to read the book. I do not mean skip reading the book and listen to it on audiobook that you've downloaded somewhere. I mean, get an audiobook. There are many different readings of this book on different various audiobook websites, which I will not reference here. But you can get it and you can listen to it as you read. That's so helpful because it won't let you stop. Like, it won't let you just sort of drop out because the recording is going to keep going. There are some that are done by great Irish actors that you can find, and even if they don't match the edition that you have, they're close enough that it doesn't matter. And so listening to it and reading it at the same time can be a really great way to make sure you get through. And you can even, like, whatever your reading pace is, sync your listening up to like 1.5 speed or 2 times speed or whatever to help you as you read. Make a schedule for reading it. I know the summer's coming. I know we've all been stuck inside forever and you want to be outside. So, just give yourself like, I'm going to read from this time to this time out in the park on this day. And that's my time for reading Ulysses. And maybe if I want to read it tomorrow, I'm going to do it at this time. What I do that helps me sometimes get through books that are a little harder or whatever is I will set a timer on my phone for 40 minutes. And I'll just have the agreement that I don't check my phone. I don't check, any social media, whatever, until the timer goes off. I'll just sit and read. And then the timer goes off and I take a 20-minute break and I can set it again or not. But this isn't the sort of book that you can read while being distracted on your phone. It just isn't. It just won't work. So make sure everything's set off, or everything is sort of quarantined into a reading time for this book, and that you know when you're going to spend time with it. So set a reading schedule. This one is already kind of taken care of for you, which is find a friend to read with. I'm your friend. Hello, I'll read it with you. I'm going to be reading it again as we go along in the course. And also, there's going to be a lot of people reading this book at the same time. So that's great. You all have friends that you can reach out to, but maybe you want to actually have someone who's lives next door to you or you talk to all the time, or someone in your household read it with you at the same time. It's good to have that support and to unravel all the sort of differing opinions of this book as well as you're reading it. The last thing, this last tip is sort of an anti-tip, which is you don't have to know the Odyssey. You don't have to correspond the parts of the Odyssey to Ulysses. I think that that's kind of an overblown and overemphasized aspect of this book. It's really interesting. It's definitely innovative for Joyce to do that. Joyce probably would be kind of pissed that I'm saying this. However, one of the things about it corresponding to the Odyssey is that it corresponds with the Odyssey to disrupt it, to show us that our lives are monumental, intense, that we go through these journeys all the time. And so just getting sort of obsessed with the mythic correspondences and the mythic structures as if this book itself weren't enough and that it had to refer to another great work, I think it's just a little too much. It is something that if you enjoy it, go and do it. And that's true with anything in this book. If you are enjoying it and I told you not to do it, or whatever, just go do it, because that's the whole point, is for you to find love for this book, the love in reading it and all that. But this book is so layered that we could talk about all sorts of correspondences. It doesn't just have to be the Odyssey one. So don't get too hung up on that. Don't get too fixated on it. So you're ready. I mean it, like you're ready. You're way more ready than probably 95% of people who have ever tried to read this book to now read this book. You have all this stuff. You have someone who has loved it, read it many times, just telling you why it's exciting. You have sort of a breakdown of the difficulties. You have some tips on how to read it. And then you have this whole course/book club sort of lined up for you and a bunch of supportive people to help you. So you really have a whole set of tools that, most people do not have when they go into reading this book. So you're ready. I think that's it. I'm so excited to read this with you. Let's go. So one last time, in case you don't know by now, MoLI.ie/Ulysses. That's it.